Tonight, the death toll is climbing after a UPS cargo plane crashed during takeoff in Louisville, Kentucky, more than 24 hours ago.
Officials now confirm at least 12 people have died, including a child.
The pilot who survived the UPS crash has finally broken his silence, and what he revealed has shaken investigators to the core. The aircraft didn't just go down, it was doomed before it ever left the ground.
Bro, get the like, turn around.
His testimony exposes failures so severe that officials fought to keep them buried, and the truth he describes is far worse than the public was ever allowed to believe. This wasn't a freak accident, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The crash that should never have happened. On the night of November 4th, the crew of UPS Flight 2976 expected nothing unusual. The MD-11 freighter rolled onto runway 17R in Louisville, under clear skies, steady winds, and perfect visibility. It was a routine takeoff for an aircraft designed to cross oceans and carry heavy cargo loads. Yet within seconds, that confidence collapsed into one of the most violent and shocking failures investigators had ever seen. Airport cameras later showed the moment everything changed. As the aircraft reached rotation speed, the left engine and its pylon suddenly tore free from the wing. Sparks sprayed backward. Flame burst across the aircraft's side. The 4-ton engine shot upward over the fuselage as if ripped off by an unseen force. The separation created an instant structural imbalance the crew had no time to counter. Flight data shows the jet briefly climbed no more than 30 feet. That is barely the height of a 2-story building. The pilot struggled with asymmetric thrust and rapidly failing lift. The aircraft rolled left, unable to stabilize. In the tower, controllers watched in shock as a fully loaded cargo jet seemed to float and then sink like a wounded animal. Seconds later, the MD-11 struck a warehouse just beyond the airport fence. Then it slid across a storage yard and into 2 more buildings before erupting in fire. The crash left wreckage spread across thousands of feet. 11 people on the ground were killed. All 3 pilots aboard died in the impact and fire. Louisville responders described the scene as beyond catastrophic. Yet one fact struck investigators immediately. An MD-11 does not simply lose an entire engine during takeoff, not without warning, not without something being wrong for a long time. When the black boxes were recovered, the most disturbing sound was not an explosion. It was a warning bell inside the cockpit that started 37 seconds after the throttles were pushed forward. The bell rang and rang as the crew fought to understand what was happening, but the failure happened too fast. There was nothing they could do. From the outside, the crash looked sudden, violent, random. But the investigators quickly realized this disaster did not begin on that runway. The real story started years earlier, and someone had tried to warn them. Because while the world was still reeling from the fire and wreckage, one pilot stepped forward with information that changed everything. His testimony revealed that the disaster was not just a tragic accident. It was a predictable failure, and he had been trying to sound the alarm long before the plane ever lifted off that night. The pilot who tried to warn them. After the crash, while officials reviewed the black boxes and mapped wreckage, an anonymous UPS pilot contacted investigators with a message that immediately caught their attention. He did not claim to know everything. He did not claim to predict the crash. But he said one thing with absolute certainty. That failure started years ago, and I reported the first signs. He had flown the same aircraft model for years. In 2019, during a routine maintenance stop, he noticed something deeply troubling on an MD-11 he was scheduled to fly. The metal around the left pylon mount, the same area that later failed in the crash, looked wrong. The surface showed discoloration that resembled overheating. The welds near the attachment area looked stressed. The metal seemed slightly warped. He asked the maintenance supervisor if they were planning to run a non-destructive test, such as ultrasonic scanning, which could reveal internal cracking invisible to the human eye. The supervisor told him no. Such testing was not required. A visual inspection was enough. His concern grew after he flew the aircraft. During takeoff thrust, he noticed a faint vibration on the left side. It was subtle, but persistent. Not turbulence, not wind. It felt mechanical. He submitted a squawk, the official form pilots use to report unusual behavior. Maintenance returned the aircraft with the response, "No defect found." Over the next months, he felt the same vibration more than once. He noticed the same maintenance pattern in the logs, lubrication completed, inspections logged, and the same simple phrase repeated after every concern: no defect found. He began warning other pilots. He told them the MD-11 left pylon mount was the one we watch. He explained that after the 2019 repair, the structure felt different. He did not claim it would fail tomorrow, but he believed the mount was weakening slowly and that ignoring it was dangerous. He insisted the issue was not about fear, it was about engineering. The MD-11's pylon design carried heavy load cycles. Cracks often began deep inside the bore, where a visual inspection could never find them. He believed that if deeper testing had been done during the 2019 maintenance, any early crack might have been caught. But the structure was allowed to continue flying. When the crash occurred, and investigators revealed that the left pylon mount's internal lugs displayed years of hidden fatigue, the pilot felt the truth hit like a punch. Everything he had warned about, the vibration, the discoloration, the stressed metal, had been pointing to the same failure. He stepped forward not to blame, but to confirm a chilling possibility. The aircraft had been structurally compromised long before takeoff, and no one listened when the signs first appeared. With the whistleblower's warnings echoing in their minds, investigators returned to the wreckage, and what they found in the metal proved he had been right all along. Inside the wreckage. When NTSB specialists began their detailed metallurgical examinations, the results were disturbing. Every critical piece of the left pylon attachment recovered from the crash site supported the pilot's warnings. The failure was not sudden. It was not caused by a single overload. It was a slow-growing structural breakdown that had been building for years. The most important finding came from the fractured lugs. These metal components hold the engine pylon to the wing through a set of load-bearing mounts. Under magnification, investigators found clear signs of fatigue cracking deep inside the lug bore, the exact place the whistleblower had feared would eventually fail. Fatigue cracks do not form instantly. They grow slowly under repeated stress cycles, expanding a tiny fraction each time the aircraft takes off and lands. Over thousands of flights, the damaged area widens until the metal can no longer carry the load. The fractures in this case showed classic fatigue beach marks, the visible steps indicating progressive crack growth. This meant the component had been weakening flight after flight, well before the final takeoff. Next, investigators removed the spherical bearing, a crucial part that allows the pylon to flex with the wing during flight. Its outer race was found cracked almost completely around its circumference, exposing the internal ball. Such damage cannot be caused by a single event. It requires long-term stress. This matched exactly what the whistleblower described when he reported strange vibration years earlier. Inspectors also found heat discoloration on parts of the pylon mount. That matched what the pilot saw in 2019, overheated and slightly warped metal near the welds. These changes were consistent with long-term mechanical stress and possible thermal effects from repeated load cycles. Pieces of the mounts were found along the runway, confirming that the failure began right at rotation. Investigators confirmed the aircraft had not been hit by foreign objects and had not suffered any unusual trauma before takeoff. Instead, the failure originated from inside the structure itself. Most chilling was the pattern of failure. The inboard lug showed advanced fatigue cracking. The forward lug showed cracking on one side but sudden overstress on the other. This indicated a sequence. First, the weakened lug failed, then all the force transferred instantly to the remaining components, which snapped under the shock load. The evidence showed that the structural failure was not a surprise. It was a conclusion, the final step of a long, invisible process. The connections to the whistleblower's warnings were undeniable. He had pointed to that exact area, the left pylon mount, and described vibration and heat patterns that matched the fracture analysis. The crash did not reveal the failure. It simply exposed what had already been happening for years inside a vital structural component. Now investigators needed to answer the deeper question: how does an aircraft accumulate such hidden damage without anyone catching it? The slow death of a pylon. Understanding the long-term failure required engineers to go back years into the aircraft's history. They needed to examine how a hidden crack could evolve without detection and why the maintenance system failed to identify the danger. First, investigators looked at how fatigue begins in the MD-11 pylon mounts. The pylon connects the engine to the wing, and the mounts carry enormous forces. During takeoff, the pylon absorbs thrust, wing flex, vibration, and aerodynamic load. Each cycle places stress on the internal surfaces of the metal. Over thousands of cycles, that stress accumulates. Fatigue usually starts inside the bore of the lug, where the spherical bearing sits. This area experiences microscopic shifts with every flight. Though it cannot be seen from the outside, the stress gradually forms tiny cracks. These cracks widen over time. Once they reach a critical length, failure becomes inevitable. Visual inspections cannot detect these cracks. Even experienced mechanics can miss them because the damage grows inside the metal. The only way to detect internal fatigue is through non-destructive testing methods like ultrasonic or eddy current inspection. But these are not part of routine checks unless certain cycle thresholds are reached. And here was the problem. The MD-11 had not yet reached the mandated cycle count for the deeper special detailed inspections. According to maintenance rules, it was still too early to require those advanced tests. That meant the internal crack could grow unchecked. Investigators then reviewed the maintenance history. In 2021, a detailed visual inspection of the pylon showed no deformation. In 2025, just weeks before the crash, the thrust links and bearings were lubricated. Maintenance was up to date. Every scheduled task had been completed, but none of those inspections included internal testing, and none could detect a crack forming deep inside the lug. The engineers compared this failure to American Airlines Flight 191, a DC-10 that crashed in 1979 after its left engine and pylon separated for similar reasons. The MD-11, being a descendant of the DC-10 design, inherited similar structural vulnerabilities. The investigators wrote in their preliminary report that the resemblance between the two events was notable. The pylon carried redundancy, meaning it could tolerate one lug weakening. But once the first lug cracked through, the remaining hardware faced loads it was never meant to handle alone. When that happened on Flight 2976, the sequence unfolded in seconds. One failure triggered another, the structure tore apart, and the engine separated. In simple terms, the aircraft met every rule. But the rules did not match the real, accumulated stress of an aging fleet. With the long-term failure understood, investigators turned back to the moments of the crash itself, to understand exactly what happened inside the cockpit in those final 37 seconds. The final 37 seconds. Once investigators reconstructed the fatigue timeline, they used flight data and cockpit audio to build a second-by-second account of the crash. The final 37 seconds were terrifying, chaotic, and nearly impossible for any pilot to overcome. At the start of the takeoff roll, everything seemed normal. The MD-11 accelerated, the engines produced expected thrust, and the aircraft rotated on schedule. But the internal crack had already reached its breaking point. The moment lift increased and aerodynamic load shifted, the weakened lug finally fractured. This triggered a violent chain reaction. The pylon mount failed. The spherical bearing gave way under shock load. The left engine and pylon separated fully from the wing. Video showed the engine flipping upward and trailing fire, leaving the aircraft with a massive thrust imbalance. Inside the cockpit, the pilots heard the first warning bell 37 seconds after they pushed the throttles forward. The bell indicated a serious fault. The crew reacted instantly, but they only had seconds. With the left engine gone, asymmetric thrust pulled the aircraft sharply left. The pilots applied opposite rudder and tried to stabilize lift, but the MD-11 was built around the assumption of 3 working engines. Losing one at rotation, especially through total structural separation, was not survivable. The aircraft reached only about 30 feet of altitude. That height is not enough to work through emergency procedures. The pilots were fighting raw physics, not a checklist. Flight data showed the aircraft began sinking almost immediately. The pitch angle dropped. The left wing lost lift because the airflow had changed dramatically after the engine ripped away. The cockpit voice recorder captured the crew struggling to maintain control. There was no panic, only rapid professional commands. But they had almost no time. The aircraft rolled left, its damaged aerodynamics dragging it downward. The pilots tried to counter the roll, but asymmetric forces were overwhelming. The MD-11 clipped the roof of a warehouse. That impact sheared part of the landing gear and sent the aircraft sliding forward. It hit 2 more buildings before erupting into flames. The fire destroyed much of the fuselage, but the black boxes survived. Their recordings confirmed what investigators already suspected. The aircraft was doomed the moment the pylon failed. No crew could have saved it. Training, skill, and experience were irrelevant in the face of catastrophic structural separation at rotation. The pilots were trapped in a situation where every second brought more loss of control. They fought until the end, but the aircraft had been fatally compromised years earlier. With the cause established and the sequence understood, the focus shifted to the aftermath and how the crash sent shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. Groundings, investigations, and the industry shockwave. The preliminary NTSB report shook the aviation industry. The discovery of long-term fatigue in the MD-11's pylon mounts raised immediate questions about the safety of the entire fleet. The FAA responded within hours, issuing an emergency airworthiness directive requiring inspections of MD-11 and DC-10 pylon structures. UPS grounded its entire MD-11 fleet. FedEx did the same soon after. Cargo schedules collapsed, routes were disrupted, aircraft were parked at maintenance hangars, while technicians scrambled to examine critical attachment points. Airlines could not take chances when one aircraft had already suffered catastrophic failure. Boeing, which inherited the MD-11 through the McDonnell-Douglas merger, opened its own engineering review. The company committed to analyzing the pylon design, the fatigue life of critical components, and whether inspection intervals needed urgent revision. Behind the scenes, NTSB engineers conducted deeper lab work. They mapped microscopic crack patterns. They tested recovered bearings. They built computer models to simulate load distribution and determine whether the inspection cycles underestimated real-world fatigue stress. Communities near Louisville struggled with grief. 11 people on the ground died. Emergency responders faced a hellish scene of burning cargo, collapsing structures, and widespread debris. Families of the pilots demanded answers and accountability. Meanwhile, aviation safety experts publicly asked whether aging cargo fleets were being maintained by schedules that were no longer appropriate for decades-old aircraft. The crash also revived fears from the past. The resemblance to American Airlines Flight 191, another aircraft losing its left engine and pylon, led experts to question whether the industry truly learned the lessons from 1979. What troubled investigators most was this: the MD-11 that crashed had not violated any maintenance rule. It was fully compliant, yet the internal crack grew anyway. This pushed regulators to consider whether compliance alone was no longer enough. Aircraft stress evolves over time. Load cycles accumulate differently depending on use, cargo weight, climate, and structural repairs. This meant standardized inspection intervals might miss real-world risks. While investigators worked, quiet discussions began inside UPS, the FAA, and Boeing about revising the MD-11's entire fatigue inspection strategy. But the industry had not yet heard the final truth, the truth from the one man who saw the danger years before anyone else. His testimony did not just match the evidence, it reframed the entire tragedy. The truth the pilot finally revealed. When investigators met with the whistleblower pilot after reviewing the metallurgical findings, everything he described matched the evidence almost perfectly. But what he explained next was the part no one wanted to say publicly. He believed the crash was not simply a mechanical failure. It was a predictable result of a maintenance culture that prioritized schedules over deeper inspection. He explained that MD-11 pilots had discussed pylon issues for years. The design carried high stress loads. The mounts often displayed early warning behavior, slight vibrations, heat discoloration, subtle structural signals. Yet because the aircraft had not reached a specific cycle threshold, no mandatory non-destructive testing was performed. He said maintenance relied too much on visual checks that could never detect internal cracking. The 2019 repair he witnessed raised every red flag. The metal looked stressed. The weld region felt hot. When he asked for advanced testing, he was told it was not required. He warned colleagues. He submitted squawks. He documented the vibration, but every concern returned with the same response. No defect found. The airplane kept flying because the rules said it was allowed to fly. He explained that internal fatigue does not follow paperwork schedules. It follows physics, it follows stress, it follows years of load cycles, even if the aircraft has not technically reached an inspection threshold. His most chilling statement was this: the failure did not begin that night. It began years earlier. That aircraft was doomed long before rotation. He believed the industry had created an illusion of safety by assuming that compliance meant structural integrity. In reality, cracks can grow unchecked inside components that appear healthy from the outside. He also warned that similar fatigue may exist in other aircraft if inspections remain tied to outdated cycle limits instead of actual stress life. His testimony pushed investigators to consider new guidelines and forced maintenance teams to look deeper than ever before. He made clear that the crash was not caused by one missing bolt, one bad repair, or one single oversight. It was a slow decay hidden behind a maintenance philosophy that followed the manual instead of the metal. His truth reframed the entire tragedy. The accident was not the first moment of failure. It was the moment failure became visible. The real disaster happened years before the aircraft ever took off, and it happened in silence. Thank you for staying with us to the end. See you in the next video.